The Fate of Being by Yuri Mamleev. Chapter 2. The Metaphysics of the I-ism. Origins of Faith. This faith proceeds from the primordial inner reality within me. On the origins of faith. Thus, the personal origin of this faith derived from a certain inner, a priori reality. It was given to me from birth. Only later, by becoming aware of this reality, did I discern the essence of faith. Consequently, this is not a religion of revelation. If you will, it is a religion of inner reality. The object of worship. The sole object of worship and faith is one's own self, the believer's I. It is immortal and eternal. What is it? The I is the only reality which, in the given moment, for the human self, is whole yet closed, though partially revealed, most fully in self-consciousness, in spirit. The I is also that which imparts selfhood, which makes sensation self-sensation, consciousness self-consciousness, that which grants selfhood to any post-spiritual plane, making it real, i.e. existent for itself. The sphere of the I that is accessible to man may be called the present I, or more precisely the given I, the realized I. What will be revealed to man later, on the steps of the otherworldly, is the future I. Future, of course, only in relation to the human self of the believer, which is bound to time. More precisely, then, the higher I, or pure self. The latter can already extend beyond the human, and indeed beyond the singular, the individual, beyond what is bound to form, space, and time. As absolute spirit, it reveals itself in the absolute I. At the same time, in the I, there is a transcendent moment, the transcendent I. Yet this too is still the personal I of the believer. On the object of worship. The given I, that is the I which is present in ordinary experience and manifests most clearly as spirit, and which is also the personal self of the believer, constitutes the immediate religious object, on the grounds that one's own I is the only reality and at the same time the highest value. Thus a natural religious object is found, and faith rests on a firm foundation. The very field of faith is the immortality of this I, its triumph and its transformation into the higher forms of the self. The higher I is the concept which embraces these forms. Although these forms may no longer be human, nor singular, i.e. not given as the being of some creature, nor bound to time, nevertheless the higher I is still the believer's own I, but one that has attained the higher stages. Thus man, this given man, is but a moment in the unfolding of the self. So then, the I as a whole is the sole, supremely valuable center reality, distinct from the visible forms of the self. Beyond my I, nothing real and valuable exists. Therefore, the higher I possesses the fullness of reality and transcendence, and at the same time it is the believer's own self, his self-becoming. And this moment is the key to the mystical mystery of selfhood. Moreover, the notion of one's own I as the sole reality renders meaningless the concept of God as a reality separate from the I. Spirit and body. The body, considered a self-sensation, is one of the lower stages of the self. Consequently, insofar as it pertains to the I, is permeated by its rays, it may be absolutized to the extent that this does not hinder the unfolding of the higher stages of the self, for example, spirit. Otherwise, the lower stages of the I must be overcome for the sake of the higher. The contrast between spirit and body is therefore a particular case of the contrast between the lower and higher stages of the self. If a situation arises in which some lower stage obstructs the disclosure of a higher, the former must be overcome. Yet since the body nonetheless belongs to the self, there is here no principled total negation. The body is not denied. On the contrary, it may be absolutized as a moment of selfhood. Thus, in the relation between body and spirit, there exists a certain tenderness, allowing the spirit to relate to the body as to its junior moment. The body is sacred not in itself, but insofar as it is permeated by selfhood. From all this, it is clear that the overcoming of a lower moment of the I, if necessary, need not take on the character of tragedy. On the contrary, performed within the wholeness of the self, and only for its sake, it may be accomplished in a perfectly harmonious way. Love of self. Since the sole object of worship and faith is the believer's own self, love of self is one of the chief religious acts. Love of self may relate to all the stages of the higher and given self. Its forms may differ depending on this orientation. Yet special value attaches to that which is directed to the I as a whole. Therefore, there exist different degrees of dedication in love of self. Distinctions are likewise evident in prayers and meditations. Prayer, of course, is directed to the higher self. One type of meditation is directed to the given self, prayer to the transcendent self. One may pray anywhere. An inner turning is sufficient. Structure. All reality is concentrated in myself. Therefore, the rest, the world, the non-self, is defined as the existence of non-existence. Hence, in the religion of the self, there is inevitably an element of solipsism, but not the usual kind, rather a special, self-being solipsism. The term reality, then, can apply only to the self. On structure. What does it mean, the world is the existence of non-existence? Undoubtedly, it is best grasped intuitively, mystically, though even this is not absolute. Naturally, paradoxical thinking and so forth may also serve as guides. First, note that this concept defines the abyss between self and non-self. On one side of the abyss lies all reality, in myself, on the other the world of non-self, including other consciousnesses. To describe it, we introduce a notion lying beyond both existence and non-existence, considered separately. One aspect of this notion is that the world of the non-self is non-being turned into existence, a phantom that can bite, a mirage that causes pain, a special category of unreality. By delving into this side, we emphasize the moment of non-existence, and at the same time the duality of the world of the non-self. All this, of course, concerns the existing relation between self and world. On the stages of the otherworldly, in another unfolding of the self, these relations between self and non-self may change. With the concept of the world as existence of non-existence is connected a most essential element of the religion of the self-being solipsism. The believer must, from the outset, possess this principle. In disclosing it, one's own self becomes the sole, real, and absolute. At the very least, there must be an organic sense of the center in one's own self. Such a sensation as grows into the ineffable totality of the self, followed by the mystical feeling of the world's non-being. This deep, original principle gives life to solipsism. Once realized, it raises the self to an absolute, dizzying height, at which it surrounds itself with such love and supreme value as were unthinkable in earlier religions, whether toward God or toward oneself, all the more so since in both these cases alienation is present, either from God as higher or from one's own self as limited. Here lies the bottomless, secret fascination of solipsism. The existence of non-existence from this side is a sign that defines the non-being and diminishedness of the world compared with the self. It's the world's utterly different opposite quality. Thus, self-being solipsism may be understood as one of the forms of expressing this primordial principle. 1. Do not fear madness in the love of self, for the madness that makes one mad comes from the world. Madness in love of self is the only madness that is blessed. 2. It is blessed also because life, for self, and love of self, is the constant destruction of the illusory reality of the world. 3. Remember, the only thing from which there is no alienation is from one's own self, and this is one of the great mysteries, which has become immediate. 4. The triumph of the self can be understood, on one plane, as the expansion of the reality of the self, expansion, or more precisely qualitative intensification, as self-sensation differs from self-consciousness of its reality, its elevation to a new hierarchical stage. 5. In the religion of the self, partly thanks to the solipsistic element, there is no difference between the individual and the absolute. Thus, upon one's own self is laid the burden of the absolute and the transcendent. More precisely, it is fused with this burden. 1. Since the religion of the self is indeed a religion, it may rely on various philosophical systems, naturally in accord with its tenets. One might create an I-ology, by analogy with theology, in which differing interpretations of certain problems may appear. Only the religion of the self itself is unshakable. 2. Love of self may be directed to all stages of the self, as well as to the self as a whole, as the total reality. A clarification is needed regarding the orientation of love toward the lower moments of the self. The possibility of such an orientation follows from the whole doctrine. Not only that, first, this orientation corresponds to the will to anticipate absoluteness at the given stage of the self's unfolding. Second, it answers the desire in loving the given self, as it were, to anticipate love of the higher self. And finally, there is always the possibility of absolutizing love for the lower moments through the penetration of rays from above. Love of the lower moments of the self must be set aside only if it hinders love for the higher self. 3. It is evident that solipsism in the religion of the self intensifies and absolutizes love of self, granting it an irresistible ultimate triumph, at times even with shades of higher trans-madness. In turn, love of self deepens solipsism. It is precisely their subtle and powerful combination of solipsism and love of self, being one of the acts of religious reality, that transforms self-being into an ineffable flower of the absolute, into the music of transcendent narcissism. 4. The religion of the self is defined not only by faith, but by being. For my heaven is within me, and it is impossible to arrive at this faith without starting from the being in which the self has already been realized to a significant degree. 5. Since the self passes through stages of disclosure, what then unites them? Obviously, that which is expressed by the prefix self, self-sensation, self-consciousness, self. Thus, selfhood may be understood as a kind of metaphysical thread. The prefix self further reveals what is concentrated within, a center, a circle, a power whose reality grows as the movement of self progresses. Therefore, what is hidden in the next self, after self-consciousness, may define a new stage of the self. Hence, through this inwardly directed activity, stages of reality are revealed which are at once hierarchical stages of value. 6. The body is sacred only when taken from the subjective side, from the side of the self, considered externally, for instance, as the play of biochemical forces. It, like a corpse, no longer belongs to the sphere of the self. The same applies to personality, individuality, etc. 7. Sufferings are legitimate if they serve the disclosure of the self. All other sufferings are meaningless. True, in almost every naked suffering there is something pathologically acute, which reveals the nearness of the self to itself, its non-alienation from itself, laying bare elements of mad love of self, and thereby sharpening the sense of the self, even in its lower forms. Generally speaking, here too there exists the possibility of turning suffering into something greater. 8. From the principles, it follows that the religion of the self is hostile or indifferent to ordinary egoism, since egoism is the absolutization, even in relation to the higher self, of purely external functional manifestations and whims of individuality, and in a certain sense is a betrayal of the higher self. It is also clear that the religion of the self is not a religion of the deification of man or his personality, since here is present the idea of the transcendent, beyond human self, which negates all that pertains to man. On the other hand, there is a difference between all divine religions and the religion of the self, even in the case whereby God is meant the higher self coexisting also in the personal self of the initiate. For here the absolutization follows the line of the quality of the divine, whereas the absolutization in the religion of the self proceeds along the line of solipsism. Such a contrast between the lower self and the higher, the subjective and the divine, loses its meaning here. For in solipsism, everything pertaining to one's own self is absolute, and what is at issue is only the disclosure of this absoluteness within itself. The personal concrete, the existent, and the absolute are bound into one mystical reality. Is ethics possible in this religion? I mean not ethics toward oneself, but external ethics, toward the world of the non-self. Of course, in that world, given the solipsistic element of the religion of the self, other people are included. Here at least 3 options may be distinguished. A. The world of the non-self, as non-being in the form of existence, does not deserve to be taken seriously in the metaphysical sense. Only oneself may be taken seriously. Hence, toward the world of the non-self there follows a deeply inward, hidden indifference. For example, another person need not be hated precisely because he is not worth it, being a phantom. All hatred, a more dependent feeling than love, underlines the reality of the object. Therefore, it is contrary to the religion of the self. The same applies to other negative feelings and actions, greed, murder, etc. B. Another understanding, not inevitable, of the world of the non-self is as a kind of alienated region of the self, whose alienation and non-being must be overcome by return to myself. From this standpoint, sincere love of the world of the non-self, including other people especially, is possible, understood as the sublimation of love of self, a sublimation that anticipates future fullness and also carries an element of distance. In this case, in the other, one secretly loves oneself. C. Finally, it is possible, without delving into the enigmatic nature of the world as existence of non-existence, to conditionally accept the world as though it were real, that is, to consciously accept certain rules of the game. Then one may also observe traditional morality, though of course in this case it will be somewhat conditional. The central interest in any case remains in the self. 10. In the religion of the self, what is necessary is not only faith, but at least some degree of self-realization. In addition, a certain tendency is required, the tendency of solipsistic selfhood and love. At the very least, meditation on oneself in a metaphysical sense, in the sphere of the religion of the self, is necessary. 11. There exists a striving, love, meditation, prayer, presentiment, directed toward the self as one's transcendent. In this lies one of the features of the strivings toward the higher self, yet at the same time it is still myself. In approaching the given self, immediacy increases in its pulsation. Yet one may also love, absolutize one's present moment as a sublimation or foretaste of the higher self. 12. Salvation in this religion, therefore, proceeds from a hidden conjunction of faith and being, from their further disclosure and interaction, from meditation, from entering metaphysical reality, from love of self, from the realization of the higher self.
Postscript. This teaching arose in me in the Soviet Union, in my youth, long before my close acquaintance with Eastern metaphysics. Thus, in Moscow there emerged a certain new cult, a kind of new religion. I consider it necessary to note here a number of important points, including those concerning the connection between traditional teachings and this one. 1. Naturally, the word new can only be applied conditionally to what belongs to the timeless sphere. Therefore, in the religion of the self, it is more accurate to speak of a new approach to such purely traditional realities as the self, Atman. Yet it is precisely the new approach that creates the new religion. 2. The term religion here is also of a highly conditional nature. First of all, the religion of the self lies outside the sphere of religions of revelation, outside the sphere of historical, and indeed of all objectivized religions. On the one hand, it is, speaking conventionally, a personal religion, that is, the religion of the microcosm, or rather the religion of the absolute microcosm, which thereby already removes the microcosm. On the other hand, it is less a religion than a metaphysical vision, which brings it close to Eastern teachings, though with significant differences. Combining these 2 points, one might say it is an innate, or rather an a priori, metaphysical vision, and one directed toward an entirely different dimension than that spoken of in objectivized religions. Thus, strange as it may seem, the religion of the self, as a personal religion, as the religion of the microcosm, may in principle, and if one wishes, coexist with an ordinary objectivized religion. Sometimes in Moscow such terms were used to clarify this religion. A, an individual religion. But the term individual is meaningless when we are dealing with purely metaphysical spheres. Apparently, people were trying to emphasize the role of myself in this religion. B, a solipsistic religion. This was a better term. Yet solipsism in the religion of the self does not have its ordinary meaning. C, an existential religion, since the concept of the self is bound to being, and thus from this standpoint we are speaking of the absolutization of self-being. Later I came to the conclusion that what I had meant by the religion of the self was neither a religion nor even a metaphysical vision, but a third path, different both from religion and from metaphysics, taking the latter in the well-known definition given in the Sophia Perennis. This third path, i.e. a third way of entering the absolute sphere, I called utrism. But in the text, I left the term religion, preserving everything in its original form. According to my understanding, utrism is such a way of entering the transcendent sphere as relies upon an a priori inner metaphysical givenness, reality, inherent in some person or group of people. 3. Obviously, utrism of the self is closest to Eastern concepts, especially Hinduism. Where then lies the essence of the new approach, and what is the difference? The difference is emphasized in the very text, religion of the self, where it is said that in the East, absolutization is directed only toward the higher divine self, whereas the absolutization in the religion of the self proceeds along the line of solipsism. In such a contrast between the lower self and the higher, the subjective and the divine, here loses its meaning, for in solipsism everything pertaining to one's own self is absolute, and all that can be spoken of is a kind of disclosure of this absoluteness within itself. Something more must be said about this. The difference thus lies in a certain strange turn. In viewing the absolute from a seemingly personal standpoint, in stressing the connection of my own given concrete being with the absolute, and in a certain mysterious projection of the absolute onto all the stages of self-being. One may also give a particular example clarifying at least one, albeit formal, side of the difference. In his work, The Quest of the Overself, Paul Brunton writes that there exists only one overself for all people, and not a multitude of overselves for a multitude of people. In fact, this is a reasonable simplification, by which, for the sake of accessibility, many factors are eliminated. For instance, the fact that the concept of number applies only to our world, whereas the sphere of the self lies beyond not only numbers, including even the one, but even beyond unity itself, while naturally beyond all division. Therefore, remaining within the limits of tradition, it is, I think, quite legitimate to assert the opposite. There exists only myself. That is, one may completely ignore the multiplicity of consciousnesses in general. This is simply a different approach to the same reality. Besides, paradox is a kind of banality of metaphysics. Such a conception, of course, is closer to the concepts of outrism of the self. And finally, as to the differences, a new approach is also, as is well known, created by a certain metaphysical coloration, by a definite emphasis on one or another quality of the self. In this case, in outrism of the self, the emphasis is on absolute superhuman narcissism. Essentially, this is that very celebrated infinite love of God for himself, of which medieval Christian mystics spoke, though here again in a new approach. Of course, on the other hand, the question may arise of the foreignness of the religion of the self with respect to tradition. Hence it should be noted that the question, whether outrism of the self is a new approach within tradition or whether it introduces elements alien to it, is not entirely clear or simple. I'm inclined, nonetheless, to think it is a new approach. Yet the introduction of such radical moments, for example, as the absolutization of all stages of self-being and outrism of the self, may well provoke legitimate doubt. Objections to this doubt, however, also exist. The absolutization of the lower stages of self-being and outrism of the self has a specific character and is not directed against the realization of the self. Otherwise, it would be sheer Satanism. Thus, this absolutization is not absolute in relation to one's own higher self, and at the same time it is absolute, since all stages of self-being belong to myself, and moreover are, in a special way, connected with the higher self. Thus, if under a certain approach, for example, ego and body are obstacles, here their illusory and negative character is simply bracketed out, cast away altogether as having no relevance to the sphere of the self, while what is emphasized is the selfhood, jainost, of all stages of self-being, and so on. The ego and body themselves, in fact, cease to be such if one goes far enough. Yet even when they remain such, they are taken not in their negative aspect.